Dr. Maya Sorini, welcome to Mindworks in Conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Tony.
And I'm really honored and thrilled to be talking with you about your new poetry collection, The Bone Heap and the Lion's Den. And having read through it, your excuse me, your poetry collection really brought up for me Leonard Cohen's song "You Want It Darker." It's the same kind of unflinching look at mortality, suffering, and reckoning with something greater than ourselves. And in Cohen's song, there's this haunting repetition of the word hineni. Here I am, as if he's both surrendering and challenging God at the same time, because of all the injustice in the world. And then there's you, an emergency doc, writing poems from what feels like the lion's den of healthcare.
Yes.
So, I'm really wondering what led you into that den? How'd you find yourself working and writing from inside of it?
So first of all, your comment about the darkness is so funny because that's what my mother always says about my work. She goes, "Oh God, Maya, does it have to be so dark?" And I'm like, "Well, Mom, this is the world. This is where I am." Um, I started working in healthcare and I started writing poetry in earnest at exactly the same time. Um, they were interrelated. So I knew in high school that I wanted to get a degree in chemistry. I love chemistry. It's the way that I see the configuration of the world is through chemistry. And so I knew that that's what I wanted to study. And so when I got to college, when I got to WashU, I wanted to make sure that becoming a doctor wasn't just the default, but was actually what I wanted to do. So I took jobs in a bunch of things that were kind of science related and care related. So I worked in a preschool, I worked in, biomedical labs, in a chemistry lab. I even did some industry work in chemistry. Um, and then finally, I accepted a job working in the trauma surgery clinical research department at WashU. And the way that that happened is I basically had lab experience at this point. Um, and they posted this couple posted a job saying, okay, we need students to do some lab work for this trial that's 24/7, 365. And I showed up thinking it was the lab job, and it was clinical research in the emergency department and the trauma department in the OR. And my soon-to-be boss asked me, okay, Maya, can you work 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Friday into Saturday and 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sunday? And I was 20 years old and I said, yes. I don't know why I thought I could do that, but I said yes. And the rest is history. That's really become my career, is saying yes to these kind of extremophile environments. And as I started working in trauma, I needed an outlet, and poetry poetry showed up for me.
So it showed up after you became a doctor, or did you start writing earlier in your life?
So I have been writing to a degree, to an extent, my whole life. I'm a very creative person. I love to fiddle and to do things and to embroider and finish furniture and like all these things, right? And so I've always been a writer and a storyteller, and that really got put on hold when I went to college. Um, People don't really believe me when I say this, but for the first 2 years of college, I didn't take a single humanities class. I only took 3 or 4 humanities classes in all of college, and they were after I started working in clinical medicine. So after I started at the hospital because I needed it. Um, so when I was working as a clinical researcher is when I suddenly needed to write poetry in a way that I had never needed it before. Um, And those poems that I wrote in probably it would be like 2016 through 2019 are the Bone Heap poems for the most part.
So you say you really need to write poetry. That can you talk about that? What is the need and how does it get satisfied through the writing of poetry?
I always say that poetry picked me. I don't choose to write a lot of the poems that I write. They pour out of me like lava. I at the hospital to this day carry a little notebook, and I will be scribbling poetry in the hallways of the hospital. These words come to me to describe whatever is going on around me, and that's not necessarily just in healthcare, but certainly I think the intensity of where I work is it gets reflected in poetry. But for example, when I was a medical student in my second year of medical school, I helped take care of a patient who um, had come into the hospital for trouble breathing, and we were now diagnosing with cancer. And I bonded a lot with this patient and particularly with this patient's wife. And on the way home one day from the hospital, I literally had to pull over to write a poem um, that contains the lines, cancer can eat bone, making grits in its effort to become. And was that poem is about that day with that family and trying to explain to them what cancer is and why he was hurting and all of these concepts. And um, that's kind of how I see it is that like I use the page as a space of memory and a space of processing. It's very narrative medicine to do that, which is that I never want to forget what it felt like and the honor that was placed upon me by that family that they could ask me questions about cancer, right? I never want to forget that. But if I don't write it down, it's going to fall away unless I keep repeating it in my head over and over and over again. And if I repeat all of the meaningful things in my head over and over and over again, I never escape them
Mhm.
and I would burn out. So the page takes that for me. And whenever I want to remember that feeling, I go back to the page and it's right there.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by what you said that poetry chose you. Can you say more about that? What is the force that is choosing you to poetry? Is it spiritual? Is it something else?
So I think definitely there's a spirit element to it, right? There's something mystical. I mean, one of my lifelong sayings is, um, it becomes to me more and more clear the more and more school that I go to that the electrons know something we don't,
Hmm.
which is kind of a poetic way of talking about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is the idea that we can never know what the electrons are doing. So there's always something mystical and not understandable in the world. And whether you choose to describe it as statistical mechanics or God, I definitely think that that's at play. I kind of choose to say God as a chemist who has at least a rudimentary understanding of statistical mechanics and of electrons. I would also say poetry itself as a form really appeals to me because of its brevity. I can tell a knockdown, drag out emotional story in very few words, very sparsely. Um, and I love that. I get very, um, I sometimes get frustrated writing prose because I have to kind of explain myself. I have to be a little bit more, I mean, for lack of a better way to say it, prosaic. And poetry lets me cut those corners, which I love. And also just generally with poetry, I love experimenting with rules and how to break them. So poetry allows me to do that. I mean, you read the Bone Heap in the Lion's Den, so you saw the Rate Your Pain poems, which
Hmm.
are my answer to the question. rate your pain? Which is a ridiculous question that we ask all the time. And Eula Biss has this um, amazing pain scale that she did, um, which is long and prosaic and wonderful and very poetic as well. But mine is short and choppy and had to be handwritten. And, the poem that the number is five has 5 lines, nine has 9 lines, one has 1 line. And to me, I couldn't tell that story in prose. I couldn't tell the story of the handwriting getting more and more hectic and frenzied. I couldn't tell the story of the responses getting longer. The lines get shorter, but there are more of them. So, this idea that your words start to get choppy when you're in excruciating pain. And I couldn't tell that story with prose. And so, poetry is right there. And I think for myself and probably many other people who lean poetry, because I do write essays. I mean, I do write fiction and prose, but poetry is just so seductive in the way that it is hyper customizable and so fast.
And you brought up a couple minutes ago this idea of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which really, to me, really kind of refers in some ways to poetry. The idea that the observation of a phenomenon changes the phenomenon itself. And so there's something very elusive about poetry itself. You could look at it 1 minute, one day, and think that you grasp the meaning. The next day, the next minute, it means something totally different. And so I love this idea of applying a scientific principle to something as elusive as poetry, or as elusive to the study of electrons and how things are constructed in the world.
Well, and I think that, one of the most profound things someone ever said to me in my life was I took this wonderful course with a professor at WashU named Jay Ponder, um, who taught me orgo, and then he also taught this course in molecular modeling and simulation in chemistry, right? How do you simulate the way that chemicals are bonking into each other, et cetera? And he once stood at the front of the room and he asked us how we thought proteins fold. Proteins, which are realistically the center of life. They are what makes up the majority of the processes that we are. He said, how do you think proteins fold? And this is a room full of super brilliant WashU people, many of whom went on to get PhDs in chemistry, which obviously I was not one. And we didn't really know. And I think maybe people gave some answers. And he looked at us and he said, the molecule is doing what all of us are doing. It is doing the best that it can. And I remember feeling like I wanted to burst into tears in that moment of like, oh my God, it's doing the best that it can. And you can micro that down to a protein and you can macro that out to a nebula. And we are in between. We are a natural phenomenon between those sizes, made up of those things. And I was like, that's one of the most important things I've ever heard. And I sometimes I'll reference that with patients. I mean, I think that that is just so applicable to living in a body and in a world made of molecules.
But applied to science, or applied to molecules, that they're doing the best that they can is itself kind of poetic. And I would love to know what was meant by that. It kind of is ascribing a certain consciousness to molecules, if that's what was intended. What do you think was the meaning of that?
I think that he was reinforcing that energy is finite, right? Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Energy is finite. So what we are all doing all the time is maximizing useful energy and minimizing useless energy. And The molecules are doing that. That's how the proteins fold. That's how bonds form. That's how it all works. And yet when we look at our lives, we are all searching for meaning. We are searching for sources of energy. Like we are meaning makers in our own lives. And one of the things that I have found very freeing about being an adult is that I choose what things in my life hold meaning and what I invest my time in and what I don't. And you know, it's perhaps mathematically more straightforward to think about the electron that is um, in a more favorable orbital if it's, in this state versus that state with this other atom. And maybe it's more complicated to think about, is my life more favorable when I have a robust writing practice or when I don't? But they're really kind of similar in that I am always looking for things to fill my cup, always looking for things to fill me and to energize me and places to apply all of this potential energy that's just bustling in my body at all times. And poetry to me is so exciting and invigorating. And like there are few feelings to me as life affirming as this is what it means to be alive, as when I just sit down and crack out a poem and it comes out on the first go. And I'm like, that's it. That's the order those words need to be in. That's the configuration of the orbitals. That's the way the poem is folding. That's the way the protein's folding. And that I love that. I love that feeling. And I think I mentioned to you the bleeding experiments series in the book. So that book was actually initially called Bleeding Experiments,
Hmm.
because I was hired to work on a bleeding experiment. That was my first job in medicine, and that series of poems, I knew that I wanted to write for 6 months, and I couldn't write it. And then one day, I got home from the hospital from a day of medical school, and I sat down at my computer and I wrote the first line of the first poem. Um, and I wrote all of those poems in that night. They just poured out of me. Um, and obviously they've been edited since then and they're not 100% original, but that I remember that feeling of being like, oh my God, what a relief, what a joy to have written those poems. I can't wait for other people to read these poems and to see this glimpse into what I'm experiencing.
I love what you said earlier about how uh, poetry comes out of you like lava
Like
from
lava.
from the depths of you, the depths inside. And it kind of waits for an opening, a fissure in the earth before it comes out of you. Also what you're saying too, the fact that you're almost bilingual. You can write in prose. I'm sure you can write a straight doctor's note. But then there's the poetic side, or the poet in you that also writes about an experience that can only be put down in poetry. It really, excuse me, really reminds me of a scene in the film Contact. Did you ever see that with
Okay.
Jodie Foster? She's an
No.
astronomer and she's taken uh, to trip through the universe. And she's a scientist and she's so overcome by what she's witnessing, she says, and she's almost crying, and she says they should have sent a poet. And that really helped me to understand how poetry and science really fit together. They're not separate. They're one leads to the other and then back again. And so you found a field where both of these really come together.
And for me, there's no split. I mean, there's no split in my poet brain versus my science brain. That's not, I think people people look for a split. They ask me about a split,
Yeah.
but it's not. And to me, it's the same idea in many ways of like, you know, we live in tension all the time of intensity, right? And so the feeling of overwhelming joy also produces tears, right? Like we're living in tension, and when you get to a certain level of intensity, anything that's at that level of intensity, they're all kind of flowing in and out of one another, right? Like people always say like, oh my God, Maya, you're such a nanny, right? Like I compulsively nanny other people. I'm always tucking my patients' toes into bed and bringing them graham crackers and things, and I used to be a nanny um before medical school, and it's like, well, yes, of course, because care doesn't know, like the act of caring doesn't know what room I'm in. It's just what comes out. It doesn't know that, like, oh, before you were, trying to get the baby down for a nap, and now you have a hysterical patient who you're suturing. And in both cases, I'm singing past decline, right? Like, because that's what care is to me. That's what I've learned helps people be calm and feel safe. And so why wouldn't I use all of those skills at the same time?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a great, I think, biological advantage, if I could put it that way. I can't think of another way to put this right now. That you don't compartmentalize in the same way that is, I think, sometimes thought of as appropriate to science. That things are in this box and then there's this box, but you don't do that.
No. And
And
I will
you
say
also
that, like,
keep clear of what's what. I mean, I just think that is a real skill. Yeah.
I do acknowledge distance, right? I acknowledge that my patient having abdominal pain is not the same as me having abdominal pain, and it's not the same as my mother having abdominal pain, right? And I've recently been going through this experience. For the 4 years of medical school, I was living with my grandmother, who's 91, and 1 week after I matched at Johns Hopkins, she was diagnosed with lymphoma. And so I have been the person that's been with her at chemo, with her at all the appointments, with her in all the hospitalizations. And it's different when it's your loved one. And I'm not going to say that I take care of my patients like they are my children or my loved ones in the same way. However, I do love my patients, no bones about it.
Yeah.
Um, I actually just wrote a poem. It hasn't been published yet. I read it actually at the event you were at, Confession. I don't tell my patients I love them, but I do check their charts laying in bed after speeding home in the starry dark on the longest night of the year. And that's a true story. I have this patient that I loved so dearly, and he'd been having all these complications after surgery. And I finally went home, and it was December 21st. I finally went home. And so I was literally in the hospital all the daylight hours. Was never out in daylight. I got to work at 4:30. I got home from work at 6 something. It was dark the whole time. Probably later, actually. Yeah, because I was on call. Anyway, and I got home and I was laying in bed on my laptop checking his chart to make sure he wasn't having a problem. And I remember that patient particularly because he was one that I really would have told I loved, because he and I were just we just had this bond. He was an old singer. He sung Frank Sinatra in bars in Jersey, and we had this creative connection, and I just needed to make sure he was okay. And I do that all the time for patients. I check on patients all the time. I'll go up after admitting someone in the ER. I'll go upstairs and find them before shift and just give them a hug. You know, these relationships matter. People matter. And it doesn't detract from my life to exert that kind of care, which it makes me sad that for some people that probably would be draining. Um, so I'm sure it would be.
Yeah, and I'm sure what's draining for physicians and healthcare workers is how to manage the pain of patients, how to feel empathy for patients and being curious about them w without it taking over your life and becoming disabled. How do you manage that? Is it through writing or is it through some other processes?
I think there's again attention to that process. So
Mhm.
I will say writing helps me a tremendous amount. Just have more space to think about a narrative and walk around it and look at it from different angles. And I talk all the time about this concept that if I give you a hard math problem, you naturally pick up a pen and paper to write it down because the page gives you more working memory and it gives you more processing power. I don't know why people don't naturally click that out to emotional experiences, but that's why journaling works. That's why writing works. It's because writing something down gives you more processing power and um, more computing power, basically, emotionally, as well as mentally, as well as problem solving. So, yes, that's a huge part of my practice. Another thing is I really love being outside. I find being in nature it just fills me up in a way that nothing else can. And so there's a poem in my second collection, which is in deep in progress, um, which begins the morning after the baby dies, I take a long, slow hike. And that's again a true story. I had this patient that I bonded a lot with in the pediatric ICU. She died, and actually after work, I went to this tiny little patch of woods near my house in North Jersey, which is not a woodsy place at all. And I just sat in the woods and just listened to birds. There were deer walking around. And to me, like taking that moment of quiet was a way to honor her humanity, my humanity, right? Like I didn't just rush home. I didn't ignore that it hurt, but I also did not spend 2 weeks crying like I'm sure her parents did. I had that level of distance, and I don't look back on that patient with regret or anger or anything but love. I'm just thrilled that I got to hold her when I did, and and that she's out in the world. I always think of her when I see Baltimore Orioles, because the day after she died, I saw and heard so many Baltimore Orioles, and she was a patient that was born in our hospital and never left our hospital due to very, very severe health conditions, which I won't go into. And I just like the idea that she got to fly, that she got to leave the hospital and go outside and play. Um, and so again, like I don't think I'm talking about her like a person who has been injured by this patient. I loved her and I still do. And that doesn't diminish my love for my next patient either. And I sang Patsy Cline to that baby a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot. She loved Patsy Cline for whatever reason. And a few months later, I had a very, very upset patient who I was suturing who was had a long trauma history and a long psychiatric history. And he started to have a panic attack, and I was suturing his hand and I started singing and he started singing with me. And all the security guards in the room and the doctor in the room and my supervising doctor, when I walked out, the security guard shook my hand
Mhm.
and said, "Nice to meet you, Maya." I was like, "Nice to meet you." And the doctor said, "Well, Maya, I've never had a medical student do that before." It's like, no, you probably won't again. But again, these experiences, they all inform each other.
Yeah, I was wondering, are you subject to joy attacks? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I think so. Um, famously, I have to laugh because this is such a Maya Sereniism that my friends all know I will do. If I drink too much coffee on a beautiful day, I text everybody that I know about how much I love them. I just am like, I can't believe I have these people in my life. I can't believe it. I'm also notorious for crying on buses and trains. I just get overwhelmed with the beauty of the world as I'm like looking at the world around me, and I can't believe my life is my life. And I had a really, probably the strongest one of those I've ever had. I would call it like the sublime, on a bus into New York City to visit my dear friend, graduate of the narrative medicine program, Margot Danby. And I was interviewing for medical school, or I was interviewing for residency and interviewing at all these programs that I was just so impressed by. And I was just like, it was this sunshiny, beautiful day on my way to see Margot and see other friends and go see a play in the city. And I just like burst into tears. I was like, I can't believe I get to be alive. What a gift. So yes, I hope that's what you're talking about.
That's a joy attack. You
Yeah,
know,
I do get those.
one time I was in a men's group for a weekend, and we together the facilitator asked us all to do Om, to sing Om, and I just burst out into tears, and I am not a crier.
Mm.
And he said, "Well, you've just had a joy attack," and that really helped me to not suppress the joy that comes from listening to great music. Um, Mostly it comes through the listening of music. When I was a child, I used to break out into tears, apparently. My mother told me, and I kind of remember whenever I heard a violin. It's, and then
Oh,
it got suppressed, and then hearing that, putting a term on it, a joy attack, was really helpful.
and it's funny because I always say that I am a person of extremes. I am an extremophile, right? The lows in my life are very low. Even just the sort of things that happen to me are quite dramatic very often. And the highs in my life are super high. And I'm someone who has struggled with panic attacks since I was a child. And I used to not like getting too happy because it felt too much like a panic attack and I would get
Hmm.
anxious. And only as an adult have I been able to acknowledge that flood of endorphins and and the increased heart rate and the fast racing thoughts and say, no, this is joy. This is not panic. Because a lot of those are similar feelings to panic, right? And so I can just say, no, this is joy. And you can just exist in the joy of it and not worry about the come down and not worry about you know, that you're gonna have a panic attack because you're not, you're happy. And it's funny, people have asked me, oh, have you ever used drugs? Do you ever do drugs? I don't need to. I have like these capital B big experiences, big emotional experiences and connections with the world all the time. I I I don't think drugs would be good for me personally.
So your joy is as contagious as the coronavirus and and other problems, I can imagine.
I try to make it that way. And one of the things that I have just found over and over and over again in my life, and the reason, and I'm going to get emotional talking about this, the reason I wrote specifically The Bone Heap and the Lion's Den is that people are good. Like that is such a radical thing to say, and yet I have received love from patients in moments I never expected a person to be capable of loving another person. And I mean, again, in the hospital, this is like a well-known phenomenon that like patients will just wrap their arms around me. I literally was responding to a trauma the other day, walking to see this kid who fell down a flight of stairs. The kid's grandmother is in the hallway. I'm walking down the hallway. She's hysterical. I just walk up to her and I said, "My dear," and she just wraps her arms around me. And we just held each other in the hallway. And all the doctors around me are like, this woman does not know you from Adam. And she didn't. I had literally spoken 2 words to her, and she just like, and I think part of that energy, I don't know how much you believe in energies and things, and I'm very agnostic on all of it because I don't know how any of this works. Again, I blame the electrons, but I think that I put out an energy of faith in humanity, and people feel that, and they just take shelter in it, and
Mhm.
they just put their arms around me. They just hold my hand. I've had patients who I had this little tiny little 80 something year old Ukrainian lady who loved me. She loved me because my name Maya is Ukrainian. And so which I'm not Ukrainian. I'm named after Maya Angelou, the poet. But that did not matter to this old lady. She was every time I would walk into her room and she only spoke Ukrainian, she would turn to her daughter and go, Ukrainian name. So funny. But as I was examining her, doing whatever, or talking with her, she would just have a hand on my waist from her bed,
Hmm.
just anchored. She would just stay anchored to me. And again, like I try to let that kind of force, that faith, that exuberance, that love of life and love of people be contagious because I think it's therapeutic for those of us who are patients and those of us who are providing care and everybody in between.
So you're named after Maya Angelou. Wow.
Yes.
It's kind of a rosebud moment.
Listen, my mother is a very special person. Abraham Lincoln said, I owe everything I am in this life to my darling mother. And I actually got her a plaque that says that for her bedroom. And don't get me wrong, I also have an awesome father and I have really great siblings as well. And my best friend who's helping me move in, she's in the other room. We've been best friends since we were little kids. Like I've been raised by awesome people, but my mom has this spark to her. She was reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings when she was pregnant with me. And that's why she named me Maya. And it really was kind of prophetic. Um,
Hmm.
I have no other word for it. That I became a professional poet. Like, like not just like, oh, Maya writes poems as a hobby. Like, no, Maya like writes books. And I cannot think of a better person to live honoring the legacy of than Maya Angelou. I mean, I've met people now who've known her. I was chatting with a man in a cafe in Rochester, New York. I came in, I was starving. I hadn't been fed by the people I had been lecturing for the previous day, and I was starving. And they were about to close, and I walk in and I look at this big, huge, hugely tall, this chef, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I know you guys are about to close. Could you make me something? I'm so hungry. And he was like, and he and I just immediately clicked, and he was like, I'm just gonna make you what I want to make you. And I was like, that sounds great. And we got to talking. And we're talking, and he's like, oh, what's your name? Maya. Oh, that's a great name. I'm named after Maya Angelou. And he said, you won't believe this. My grandma was one of her best friends. I knew Miss Maya growing up. And I was like,
There it is. The
there it
connection.
is. Here I
Wow.
am in Rochester, New York. For 3 days, I was in Rochester, New York doing some teaching. And I meet someone who knew my namesake in a cafe who literally prepared me a meal just for me. Like, come on. The electrons know something we don't. Come on.
Hmm. That's just another example of poetry choosing you. And to get back to the darkness, because I have a
Yeah.
feeling, again, there's this relationship between the darkness and the light that maybe we don't appreciate the light unless we go through the darkness. I'm not sure. Um, but can you please read? You talked about you reading, starting with The Angel in the Lion's Den.
Oh, yes.
If you could read those three poems.
Absolutely. And I will say about darkness, there's this quotation, darkness or light thinks it's the thing that travels fast in the universe. but darkness was always there first, which I think is a beautiful uh, thought experiment on darkness. But these poems are the center of the collection, as you mentioned. This is The Angel in the Lion's Den. The angel flies down, and the lion's jaws don't bite. Every mouth stuck shut in gentle whiskering, sharp teeth sheathed. Those first hours of warmth, the Daniel warmth, the fur on him weak, a warm slip, his warm small hands and his warm small breath. The lions sleep at night for the first time with their new Daniel, who makes them hungry but docile. A pride of sleeping breath floating out of the den, curling into Medea, his small warm breath sweet smelling. The hunger of him seeps into the air. The Daniel kneels restless, making small warm sounds, while the lions bat at the bones. The guilt settles heavy on him, with cubs and mothers snuffling at his head gently, learning their Daniel, mothers without milk today. Daniel in the lion's den. The angel takes pity on the lions, comes back, unseals the jaws, and the lions stare softly. The Daniel dares not move. The mothers come nuzzle him to sleep, the best cure for hunger they know. This is the story of a Daniel who stays, whom God smiles on and kings leave to die, who is warm and soft and good, who learns to suck marrow after the lions dismantle their infidels. This Daniel, the one who stays, sleeps on the bellies of the lions. They eat apart at first and then together, him just the marrow, though the mothers try to give him more. The small, warm Daniel grows his own wispy fur all over his tiny body, upon which the cubs curl after noon. The Daniel pleads his small sounds and shuffles through the carcasses, looking for marrow, combs and frets with the manes, and the mothers keep thinking the Daniel will grow, but he stays their cub. A bone heap in the lion's den. So the Daniel sucks the marrow, and his breath smells sweet, and the lions lay their paws upon him, their claws sheathed, and he falls under their weight, and they wait for him to get up, and he slowly gets up while they lick and tussle him. And the cubs grow, knowing only the time with the Daniel, and they know the Daniel does not grow bigger, just darker around the face and smaller in the eyes, and he stops making so many sounds, and he stops kneeling on his little legs, and he starts eating the bloody morsels, once chosen people, and he stays up through the dark for many cubs and many nights and many infidels until he finally falls asleep. One last time, the bone heap.
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading. A couple questions. I'm really struck by the Daniel, putting it that way. Can you talk about that?
So this poem, if I can even call it that, began without Daniel. It began with the idea of a bone heap in a lion's den. And it began that way because that's how I was describing myself at a very dark period of my life. I was going through a lot, my last year of college, and I wrote this line, I am a bone heap in the lion's den, something along the lines of look at the lions and tell them to go gnaw on something else. Um, and that idea kind of sat with me for a while. And this idea of the story of Daniel in the lion's den and this miraculous survival, right? And this miracle, God smiles on Daniel and the king frees him. And so I went and I reread that Bible passage. I grew up Christian and I don't practice much now, but I went and I looked at it because I was curious what I was remembering and reading the passage, Daniel 6:16, I was sort of inspired to then go write another version of the poem. And I wrote it as the Daniel in part because I want this poem to come off as from the point of view of the lions. And lions don't necessarily know what a Daniel is. A Daniel is a very strange thing. It comes into the lion's den, but they can't eat it. The angel won't let them eat it. And so it's something different. And what would happen if he stayed? And what do we know about animals? I mean, they bond with people. They bond with us and even the most ferocious things. And so this poem evolved that way of like, how would the lions describe this experience? And what would happen if the king never comes back and brings Daniel out? What if the king is not moved by the miracle? Um, and as I wrote this and fleshed it out, it became a poem about healthcare. And it's a poem about um, what it is like to descend into the world of emergency care, trauma care, as a person who, for some reason, is being spared what your patients are going through. And and I find being a doctor, being a healer, feels like such a miracle to me. It feels like such a blessing. Um, I've never felt forsaken by a higher power in the work that I do. I am forsaken by powerful people who think that what I do all day is make them money and who don't know a damn thing about the lions because they've never actually met the lions. And those are the people that assign us wellness modules to prevent burnout. And their wellness modules seem to be all about here's how you here's how you survive the lions. And what I want to say to any administrators or hospital presidents or CEOs who are listening to me and who are going, God, I keep putting my people down here and they get torn apart by the lions. Um, my question is the following. Are you sending them down as sacrifices? Because if you are, then they're probably going to get eaten by the lions, first of all. Seems obvious. And B, are you sure that the lions are the problem? Or could Daniel have survived quite happily there if you had just fed him? If you had let him come home every once in a while and then go back and sleep on the bellies of the lions? What would happen if 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 the world of healthcare was gentler to Daniel, to me? What happens? And I ask this as someone who has worked 24s, who is going to work 28s in residency coming up, who works a lot of 12s, a lot overnight. And my question is, right, like, do we have to be cruel to our healthcare workers the ways that we are? And I think we don't. I mean, listen, I'm going to work overnights regardless because people need care at night. I don't mind working overnights. Um, but am I being supported? Are people realizing the work that I'm doing and the worth of it and what my patients need? And are they making it easier for me to take care of my patients? Like are they facilitating that happening? And for me, that's the thesis of this book is not that I don't love my job. It's not that I don't love my patients. It's that I acknowledge that my job is a lion's den. And sometimes I get thrown down there with nothing to eat but bone marrow. And I don't want to have to be a cannibal to work in my job. I don't want to have to chew other people. I don't want to have to do that.
So there's the Daniel, and then there's the Maya in the lion's den. Um, I just love this process of reimagining, for example, another piece of literature, and definitely the Daniel story. I had to go back and reread that as a piece of poetry. And it made me think of narrative medicine, the process of prompted writing.
Yes.
And almost what you did was a prompted writing response to the story of Daniel in your way, an extended writing prompt.
Oh, yes. I
Uh,
write to prompts still all the time. I love writing to prompts.
yeah. So that really helps. That process of writing through prompts really helps us to go deeper into whatever work that we're considering.
Absolutely. And one of the first pieces of advice I give to people who say, I want to write, but I don't know where to start is start with plagiarism. Start by rewriting something that you love. Start by quoting it heavily. And what you will find is that over time, you fall out of that. So I'm obsessed with Richard Siken. I think he's the most brilliant poet in America, contemporary poet. His next book comes out very soon, called I Do Know Some Things. Shameless plug. I can't wait. Um, it I have written poems that started off as me just quoting Siken, and that then I spin my own way, and you can get really far doing that.
Well, I think starting off, by plagiarizing your work, so to speak, could take us to our own level, to a different level as well. So it's really important. This work that you're doing, combining medicine, art, and yourself, descending into the lion's den of healthcare, dealing with a ferocious business model that makes it very difficult to do the work for which you were trained. So I just want to thank you so much for this interview, Maya, and really look forward to reading your next work. So can't wait to
Absolutely.
read it again.
Thank you, Tony. And I do have work, you know, scattered around that will be in the next book um, that I am excited about. Um, and thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about bone heath and to talk about, this work that I do, which I really love.